One of the most notable visual changes in 64DS is the general color scheme of Bob-Omb Battlefield. There's a brightened and yellow tint throughout the map that might actually be the most obvious visual change to a stage in the entire game. It's funny because Tiny Huge Island kept its classic color scheme, and that was based on the same theme as Bob-Omb Battlefield. But I guess they really wanted to distinguish the opening stage of DS to make the game stick out a bit more as its own, and this was the move they made to do so. But I honestly don't really like the new look of it. I much prefer the Nintendo 64 look, but I'm also not going to allow that look to hinder the experience. In case this is the first video you're joining in on, I'm currently doing a run-through of all the Mario 64 DS stages to analyze the major differences of the stages with the addition of the new stars, as well as any other major changes that could potentially alter the experience. With an emphasis on major changes, because I would classify minor changes like the inclusion of a block along your path an insignificant alteration of the player experience. If you're interested in my actual full analysis of Bob-Omb Battlefield stars as well as the remaining stages, you can head back to the start of this playlist and start from there. But going forward, I'm only here to analyze the differences in DS and whether or not those changes make the DS version of each stage the definitive Mario 64 experience. As a refresher, I've broken it up into 4 different categories. The first is the inclusion of the new star, and if that star improves the overall experience of the stage or if it just feels like pointless fluff. In the case of Bob-Omb Battlefield, that new star is the 5 silver stars. Throughout 64DS, many of the new star challenges include either 5 collectible silver stars or a switch you have to press and race to grab the star before time runs out. I've heard many people shrug off all of these stars as pointlessly repetitive, but I think there's merit to many of them in the game, even if a few of them could potentially feel redundant or mundane. In the case of Bob-Omb Battlefield, I think I like the inclusion, but it's really close to the line of pointless fluff. And keep in mind, they're marked on the map, so it's less about searching and more about being able to grab them. The first star is easy enough. Climb the tree and grab the silver star. The second one I'm a big fan of though. Chain Chomp is running riot in the field to the right. The silver star is just behind him at the end of the chain. You need to maneuver around the back of him to collect the star. The third one is hidden inside a Goomba by the stumps you can hip drop down, and you have to defeat the Goomba to grab it. The next one is out on the field to the left of the stumps, bouncing around in the flower patch. And the final one is hidden in a Goomba fairly early on along the climb up the summit. After collecting all of the silver stars, our player has to make their way back to the beginning of the stage to get the star. If you take a hit, you drop the stars, but they're pretty easy to pick up if that was to happen. The reason I say this star is close to the line of pointless fluff is because the first star is simply on top of a tree right in front of you, which feels like a wasted challenge. I guess this is the first star of its kind in the game, that's their way of introducing it, but still, it feels a bit pointless. And the other issue I have is that the star next to the stumps hidden in the Goomba, well, over there's some red coins, so I don't know why they threw a silver star in the same area. But aside from that, I like the one dragging along the back of the Chain Chomp. That's a pretty unique way to utilize a metallic puppy ball. And I like the one in the flowers for no other reason than the fact that in OG64, I always felt like this area was wasted space. And the one on the lower part of the summit I'm okay with because it's in an area that a player would normally just run by. So although it just barely makes it, I think this additional star is a good inclusion to 64DS. The second category to look at is any changes to the stars from the previous games, and if they make the stars better, worse, or negligible. On OG64, star number 3 was Shoot to the Island in the Sky, which saw you take Mario and blast up to the island in the sky, break open a yellow block, and collect a star. Easy enough. Technically, that star was replaced with the 5 silver stars since that's the third star in 64DS. But I think it makes more sense in this instance to say it was replaced by a second fight with Big Bob-Omb. See, the first star of the stage in 64DS is technically the same one from OG64, in that it has the same name and the same general premise. The difference is the fight is catered around Yoshi's moveset, which involves using his tongue to grab and launch the smaller Bob-Ombs at the king. However, they did bring back the OG64 battle with Mario, or Mario's Cap, and then you can take on King Bob-Omb in the same way you defeated him on Nintendo 64. So basically, to tie all of this up, the question is if the removal of Shoot to the Island in the Sky is worth removing for the sake of the second fight against King Bob-Omb, because that's basically what it comes down to. While I think having 2 fights against King Bob-Omb somewhat feels repetitive, the differing movesets of Mario and Yoshi allow the fights to feel like their own unique challenge, even if that means you're making yet another trek up the summit. And honestly, I think that extra trek up the summit in most cases would irk me, but when you consider that's replacing Shoot to the Island in the Sky, I don't mind it as much. I don't have that much of an issue with Shoot to the Island in the Sky, but considering Mario Wings to the Sky is right up there on that island in the sky, it also just feels like you could remove the first one and not lose any value. The primary difference is Shoot to the Island in the Sky used to be meant to get players up there prior to unlocking the red wing cap, but I don't think it's such a drastic loss that it would ruin a player's experience. So in the case of the changes to the star, I think what the DS has done is ultimately an improvement, even if it's minor. The third category is in relation to major stage alterations, which in the case of Bob-Omb Battlefield, I wouldn't say there's anything major. I mean visually, sure, but we're talking about mechanically. There are a few punchable blocks that show up during some of the stars, and King Bob-Omb is standing in the middle of the summit when you first get up there, but I'd classify those changes as negligible or minor at best, so we'll call this one a wash. The final category is whether or not the inclusion of the map drastically alters the total experience of this stage, and in this case, it doesn't. The fights against King Bob-Omb are on top of the summit, having a star on the map highlighting that won't change much of the mission. Likewise with Chain Chomp's Gate. Thankfully, the red coins don't automatically stay on the map, but there are pink Bob-Ombs you can interact with that will show you their location briefly. I think this is a fair compromise. It adds the benefit of the map without completely ruining the whole hunt for the red coins. Much like the inclusion of the maps in general, it does make the DS version easier, but I'm not sure if it makes it so much easier that it ruins the experience. Or at least that's the case in Bob-Omb Battlefield. The race with Koopa the Quick does have a star on the map where Koopa stands, but that's also because a player has to go and grab Mario's cap first before coming back to race against him. I probably should have mentioned that as an alteration to the star, since you can't just start the stage and challenge Koopa immediately like you could in the 64 version. But I think I'll give it a pass since it's not a huge alteration and it also teaches the player about the cap mechanic. Either way, while having a map is nice, I don't think the inclusion of the map drastically alters the experience in this case. But to wrap everything up in this stage, with the inclusion of the 5 silver stars objective as well as the removal of Shoots Down in the Sky in favor of a second character boss battle against King Bob-Omb, I'd say the DS version of Bob-Omb Battlefield is effectively an improvement on the original. It's not such a drastic improvement that I would say you shouldn't even return to OG 64 for this stage, but it's a decent enough change where I can claim that the remake has done enough to win my pick as the better version of the Battlefield. Also, in regard to the bonus category I mentioned in the previous segment, Luigi's backflip doesn't really break any of the stars in the stage due to the stage's layout and the locations of the stars. Also, most of the stars in this stage will be realistically grabbed by a player prior to even unlocking Luigi. There might be a red coin or two that will be easier to grab, or it just might be a little bit more comfortable to grab the 100 coins, but I'm not looking for those slight crutches. I'm looking for those major moments where his backflip can completely alter a star challenge. Don't worry, it'll be relevant soon. Because next, we're heading over to WHOMP'S Fortress. WHOMP'S Fortress DS gets points for me strictly because the thwomps look like actual thwomps and not whatever the heck this blue monstrosity was in the OG game. The biggest change in the art style of WHOMP'S Fortress is they got rid of many of the darker browns on the pathways up to the fortress itself in favor of a bright color for Mario to run on. Unlike in Bob-Omb Battlefield, I prefer the change in the art style. I think the brighter colors make the walkable areas of the stage pop, and it makes your character stick out just that little bit more. Moving straight into the drastic changes of this version of WHOMP'S Fortress, the most notable one people will discuss is the additional land around the bottom of the fortress. This was basically included to help negate all of the random falling and sliding off the sides of the fortress to your doom that many players would have been all too familiar with. But it also kind of defeats the purpose of the platforming challenges players will undergo over bottomless pits. By nature of this inclusion alone, many of the stars will have to be assumed to be easier for first-time players. And quite frankly, this makes the DS version an easier stage than the Nintendo 64 version right off the bat. But I think it's worth getting deeper into the analysis to see if the ease ruins the stage, or if it is even that drastic of a change. The new star added to the stage is a switch star, and it's actually set up in the new area around the stage that I just mentioned. I think it's pretty easy to say this star is a good addition because it quickly allows a player to get acquainted with a new section of the stage, and gives them a fun fast-paced challenge to traverse around it in its entirety. It's an easy star, but I don't think it's a pointless star, so I'd count this as a point for the DS version. As far as alterations to the star go, aside from the cage the owl drops you in being a lot easier to access, the stars here don't actually change, but the addition to the bottom of the stage causes a few of them to be easier. Those being chip off the WHOMP'S block and to the top of the fortress primarily. But they're only easy in the sense that falling won't make you lose a life. Instead, it'll bring you back to the beginning of the stage, so I don't think that change matters that much. You're still starting the stage from the beginning. The red coin star changes a bit too, in that the red coin that used to be on the slanted area below the rotating platform is no longer there and instead is placed in the new area of the map, which again I don't think is that drastic of a change. That being said, this additional area makes the 100 coin star much easier and, in my opinion, almost to a fault. Partially because it adds more coins that are easy to grab, but also because it'll save players from falling to their doom and would have to restart the coin collection all over again. And the 100 coin star in this stage was already really easy, so they just made it borderline mindless. Quite frankly, I think I prefer the stars as they were in the original version. I could be alone in thinking this, but I think the owl star and the 100 coin star alone make the OG 64 version better. And that sort of ties straight into the stage alteration, which I've obviously already discussed. While I understand they wanted to find a way to make the stage a bit more forgiving and accessible for newcomers, I think they forgot to consider that this was already a fairly easy stage. There was just enough challenge spread out that this didn't just become Bob-Omb Battlefield Part 2. Because Now that's what it feels like. By the time a player is done with Bob-Omb Battlefield, they're supposed to come into WHOMP'S Fortress and slowly take the training wheels off during some minor platforming and timing challenges where bottomless pits are a genuine risk. But the changes to the stage just remove all of that risk and in turn remove any incentive a player has to learn to better control their character without the risk. The whole point of those challenges isn't strictly for the sake of having a challenging WHOMP'S Fortress. It's to help train a player to get better as they move on to later stages in the game, especially since this is the second stage in the game. If you remove that risk, you also remove the added benefit of teaching a player how to safely traverse throughout the area with caution since they now have a safety net. And again, WHOMP'S Fortress was already pretty easy. It's not like you threw a safety net beneath Rainbow Ride. You made an easy stage go from having a slight minor challenge to virtually no challenge at all. The OG wins in this department. And finally, there's a consideration of the added map in this stage, and I'm just going to gloss past this one because it's similar to Bob-Omb Battlefield in that none of the stars are actually helped that much with the inclusion of the map. I specifically appreciated that Blast Away the Wall didn't have a star in the location of the wall because that would have defeated the purpose of the puzzle altogether. But if it isn't obvious, I think this version of WHOMP'S Fortress is a downgrade on the original. I can appreciate that certain players may enjoy it more because of the easiness, and that might make it more accessible, but as someone that didn't find the original version of WHOMP'S Fortress to be nothing more than a minor challenge, I think the added safety net takes all that minor challenge away and it's for the worse. The only slight benefits I can give the added location is that it creates cohesion throughout the stage and connects different locations, and it also effectively adds a third branched alternate route to make the stage a bit more unique. But I don't think that these added benefits outweigh what I consider to be negatives in this version of WHOMP'S Fortress. I gotta go with OG64 for this stage. But once again, you shouldn't assume that because I picked the OG version it means I think the DS version is a bust. On the contrary, just like in Bob-Omb Battlefield, while I may favor one version over the other, I still think both versions have enough to make them an enjoyable Mario 64 experience. But if I had to choose one, in the case of WHOMP'S Fortress, it's definitely the OG version. And finally, to wrap things up, there's Luigi's backflip and how many stars it breaks, and by my count there's 3 of them. The top of the fortress, shoot into the wild blue, and the red coins. Which quite frankly is a lot more than I expected already, but in fairness, this is a linear stage that requires upwards traversal, so it makes sense that Luigi's backflip would be super useful for this. But I think that's enough discussion on WHOMP'S Fortress. I think I'm ready to revisit Jolly Roger Bay and see if the DS found a way to make me like that stage more than the original.